Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good Wednesday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 26th of November. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date on your very latest weather information, whether it's just a look at the satellite picture, your current weather observations, or you want to dig into the climate facts around your part of the state. You can do that easily by going to weather.gov/Alaska, or if your favorite is already arh.noaa.gov, that'll work just as well. The weather info line is open at 800-472-0391. You can always find us on Facebook in between the Alaska Weather Show. That's at NWS Alaska. And if you've checked that out recently, you will have noticed a briefing from the National Weather Service office in Juneau talking about the Taku wind that's going to crank up later this evening and probably already starting to pick up a little bit. We'll talk more about that in just a few minutes, but you'll also find more detailed information on that social media briefing there. You can find us on Twitter, of course, at NWS Alaska, NWS Anchorage, Juneau, and Fairbanks there, all using the hashtag AKwx if you like to talk about the weather, and find us on YouTube during the day, especially around 4 o'clock in the afternoon from NWS Anchorage and NWS Fairbanks. You'll get your daily afternoon map briefing there if you want a sneak peek at what we're going to talk about here in Alaska Weather. Now on to tonight's hazardous weather and into tomorrow. High wind warnings there starting up around 3 o'clock in the morning and going at least until midnight tomorrow. Looks like we're going to be dealing with some Taku winds that are probably up to about 60 to 65 mile an hour gusts there through the Juneau area and through the northern parts of the inner waterways. So keep that in mind. Watch for winds to pick up as we head through the rest of the evening hours, and probably on the order of gusts of 40 to 45 miles per hour through the early evening, and then overnight they should really start to pick up, all because of a really strong high pressure system out here across the Yukon. You'll see that on the surface charts in just a few minutes. The results of stable air as well across the Matanuska Valley tonight should continue to produce some locally dense fog in that area, probably through about 9 o'clock tonight before we see some change in that visibility. So what that means is if you're heading out to Grandma's house or trying to fly in tonight, you're going to be dealing with some pretty crummy conditions around the Palmer Airport. Watch for visibility to remain below about a quarter mile there around the Matanuska Valley. And again, we expect that to continue to at least about 9 o'clock until we start to see some improvements. The rest of Alaska is not looking at any major warnings, watches, or advisories at this point, so we'll turn it to the Bering Sea satellite picture, and you'll notice the large area of low pressure working through the central Aleutians right now. It's got a decent amount of moisture attached to the front side of that, and the leading edge of that frontal boundary is working its way through the central and eastern parts of the chain now, approaching Nikolsky as we head into the late afternoon and early evening hours. The triple point part of that low, where the best moisture is located, is moving through the eastern Aleutians at this point, but the main corridor of low pressure is still sitting across the central and western sections of the chain. Now with a storm like this, it's not a surprise to many of you that we'll have gale warnings out for a large part of the Bering Sea and the northern Pacific at this point. Behind that, colder, drier air spilling in. You can see that mackerel type sky spreading in behind the low pressure system. That's a good sign there's some colder air wrapping into the western side of the system. As we look at the rest of the state of Alaska, most of what you're dealing with across the interior, at least by this view, is just cold air showing up on the satellite picture. In this case, our satellite is sensing the atmosphere with more of a thermometer rather than an actual snapshot of the atmosphere. And in this case, we're drawing in a lot of cold air from pretty much Galena eastward all the way through Arctic Village, Northway, Fairbanks, and even in some cases over Anchorage. Out across the west, though, another leading edge of clouds is spreading rain and snow across the south and western coast. Rain was reported there around Sand Point. And remember the cold air we were talking about? Well, out in Shemya, I saw a little bit of light snow there today, with rain being reported around Adak and Atka, as well as the eastern Aleutians, and snow was falling across a good chunk of the western Seward Peninsula, with some light snow across the northern coast as well. Southeast looking fairly dry, with the winds setting up again. That's helping to keep your sky pretty clear. Here's a look at the surface chart here in just a moment, and you'll notice those western clouds slowly fanning out across the interior, but as we go ahead in time, we'll start to see the effects of high pressure weakening, and more cloud cover will spread eastward. And there were a few places across the interior today that saw some light snow, some of those around the Fairbanks region. Most of the snow was concentrated out across the Seward Peninsula, and some areas across the western Aleutians, including Shemya. The low pressure system across the Aleutians has dropped to 982 millibars. High pressure across the Yukons up to 1,042 millibars. And it's going to be this pressure gradient here across southeastern Alaska and the western Canadian provinces that really sets up that wind. Notice how fast that packs in as we head into the overnight hours. So once again, the Juneau area is under a high wind warning starting around 3 o'clock in the morning for Thanksgiving and heading into about midnight that night. Gusts on the order of 60 to 65 miles per hour should be expected, so it's going to be pretty turbulent, and storm warnings are already in effect for the waters there. Low pressure moving into the Bering Sea at 982 millibars continues its slow approach past the Pribilofs and toward Nunivak Island. The occlusion will work its way northward toward St. Matthew as we head into tonight and keep the southwesterly winds going across the western and southern tip of the Alaska Peninsula. Clouds should be fairly sparse across the interior and the upper Yukon Valley as well as the North Slope. High pressure just across the Beaufort Sea at 1,035 millibars continues that wrap-around wind that's moving winds offshore at this point for areas from Barrow and northward. For areas around Kaktovik, it's still a light north and easterly flow. We'll keep relatively light winds going there for the next several days. Fog still possible across south central sections of Alaska and anywhere where the ridge is a little bit stronger across the lower and middle Yukon. Southeast again continues under a clear sky with a trough of low pressure sitting just offshore. Perfect position for high pressure to move wind right through some of those channeled areas of terrain and keep the winds going through a good chunk of your Thanksgiving day. Across the lower and middle Yukon, areas of fog should be expected there for Thursday, Turkey Day. Across southwestern Alaska, some pockets of rain and snow are expected. Light snow generally from the lower Yukon Valley into Norton Valley and the western tip of the Seward Peninsula. 986 millibar low there just west of St. Matthew, and you can see that weakens a little bit as it heads a little bit further south. Another trough will cross through the central and eastern Aleutians. Some pockets of light rainfall expected there. And for Thursday afternoon, expect some light rain to pass through Cold Bay, False Pass, and up toward Point Hayden and past Cape Sarachev. Kodiak Island looks fairly dry for Thanksgiving Day, but by Friday things could change there as the trough of low pressure extends into the North Pacific. High pressure is weakening a little bit across southeastern Alaska. The trough is still in the same place, but the high pressure center is shifting around a little bit, and we're starting to see some changes in the pattern there for southeast, so the winds should not be as strong as we get into Friday if you're looking to do anything outside. Across the central or the middle and upper Yukon, expect the clouds to start to fill in. We'll probably have some fog under that as well, and don't be surprised if you see a little bit of a flurry activity. Most of that won't be terribly substantial, but with the cold enough air in place and a little bit of moisture added in for fun, there'll probably be a few dendrites falling from time to time. Low pressure around the Gulf of Anadyr rises to 998 millibars. That's filling in, so it's not going to be as strong on Friday as it moves further northward. A southerly flow continues, though, from the YK Delta into Norton Sound, Seward Peninsula, and with that we would expect a little more snow showers and probably some rain and snow around St. Lawrence Island. Northward from the Chukchi Seacoast, some areas of fog and flurries, maybe some light snow should be expected there for Friday. And out across the west and southward, you can see a high pressure system focusing on the central Aleutians with warmer air already building in on the return flow coming in from the North Pacific. And that will continue working its way northward as we head toward the weekend. We'll keep an update going on that as we head into Saturday, and make sure you tune in tomorrow for the latest out in the west. Here's a look at temperatures today. Across southeast, most areas were in the mid to upper 30s with the wind there. Expect temperatures to remain fairly mild as we go into tonight and tomorrow. Around Prince William Sound, lower to mid 30s were seen this afternoon. 28 in Kenai, a little bit cooler there, and 25 in Anchorage with some light snow reported today. Squentin was 19. Healy saw about 3 degrees with Fort Greely at 12. Northway was 5, Eagle only 6, and Fairbanks saw 7 degrees late this afternoon. 8 below in Fort Yukon, and you'll notice around Bettles it was 14 below, 24 below in Arctic Village, and with the rise in elevation there, Anaktuvik Pass was about 2 below. The Arctic coast saw temps between 5 and about 10 below. Once you got inland a little bit, like Atkasuk, it was 13 below. Wainwright was 9 below, and Point Hope and Point Lay were in the lower teens. Kotzebue Sound mostly was in the low to mid-teens as well. Shishmaref saw 18, Kivalina 13, and 28 was the temperature seen around Nome at 3 o'clock. Norton Sound temperatures, we're looking at readings generally just below freezing, upper 20s for most areas there. Hooper Bay about 33. McGrath was around 19 degrees. Bethel saw 31 late this afternoon. Lake Iliamna in the upper 20s to lower 30s. Bristol Bay was looking at temperatures hovering around freezing for most of the afternoon. And as you head down the Alaska Peninsula, most places were showing temps in the lower 30s there. Sandpoint was 43, Cold Bay and False Pass both at 40 degrees. Kodiak saw temps just below the 40-degree mark, and the Pribilofs were just above it. Around Adak and Atka, temps generally hovered in the lower 40s, and Shemya was cold enough for some snow. It was 36 by 3 o'clock. Overnight low temps will cool off into the low to mid-20s tonight. Coastal areas hovering around the 30s for Sitka and places closer to Ketchikan, Annette, and Craig and Klawock. Prince William Sound will hover in the 20s, but most of South Central will drop into the lower teens, including Kodiak, Homer, and Seward. It looks like 9 in Squentna tonight, 13 below in Fairbanks, 22 below in Fort Yukon, 26 below in Arctic Village, likely heading for the coldest temperature in the land for tomorrow morning, and 8 below in Barrow with Kotzebue Sound temperatures in the teens, 24 around Nome, low to mid-20s for most of the YK Delta, Bristol Bay closer to 30, Kodiak 32, and the Aleutians just below that 40-degree mark. High temperatures tomorrow in the lower 40s there. Southwest in the mid to upper 30s. Norton Sound temperatures in the lower 20s with Nome at 28. Barrow's looking at 4, Fort Yukon at 15 below. Well, it looks like Fairbanks will hover close to 0 tomorrow afternoon. And for Thanksgiving Day in South Central, expect high temperatures in the lower to mid-20s. Some of the warmest weather will be around Prince William Sound and probably coastal areas in southeast with temps in the mid to upper 30s there. Juneau, you're looking like temperatures will hover in the mid-20s with wind. Now, flying weather shows IFR conditions north of Kotzebue Sound toward Point Hope and Point Lay, with MVFR conditions heading up toward Wainwright. Just about all of the interior and most of the Beaufort Seacoast, South Central, and Southeast will see clear flying weather tomorrow, with IFR conditions for the West Coast, as well as St. Lawrence Island and parts of the Norton Sound region, including Nome and points westward with MVFR for most of the chain. Let's check your pass conditions, though, just to be sure. Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass are both expected to be VFR. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass are expected to be visual throughout the day. Rainy Pass, we expect to see visual flight rule continue throughout your Thursday, and Thanksgiving Day looks VFR for Windy Pass, with Isabel Pass also at VFR. Now, Mentasta Pass, we expect to see visual flight rule there. Tenita Pass is looking good. Portage Pass, probably okay. And Chilkoot and White Pass, while looking at VFR, don't forget about that turbulence through the region as well. There could be some moderate to occasionally severe turbulence there. Freezing levels show the cold air is retreating in the upper levels. That's dropping to 2,000 to 4,000 feet, generally south of the Dixon entrance and also around the Alaska Peninsula. You'll notice that rising just a little bit into the Bering Sea. Otherwise, the surface freezing lines hovering right around the northern and eastern Gulf Coast and then wrapping up toward the Bering Strait there. 2,000-foot freezing level shown just south of St. Lawrence Island, so there are some pockets of warmer air to be had, but not a whole lot's left. Icing potential seems to be fairly thin. It's running fairly close to the frontal boundary, as you would expect, around the Alaska Peninsula, and above 4,000 feet is where you'll run into some isolated, maybe some occasional, this should be occasional moderate, I should say, south of Sand Point, so don't get too excited about that. Light to isolated moderate across southwest and also across the eastern sections of Siberia, and some pockets of light to isolated moderate across the central and western chain, generally west of St. Matthew. Our jet stream shows a kind of a progressive pattern now, with low pressure sitting across the west, just off the west coast really. The main quarter of the fast-moving river of air, around 30,000 feet, is pointed from northwest to south and east and really digs out across the central and eastern Pacific. As that's happening, that's making room for more cold air to slowly infiltrate, especially the central and eastern sections of Alaska. And as this fills in a little bit more, we'll get more and more cold air working into central and western sections of Alaska. But for right now, low pressure is still sitting across the central and western Bering Sea, and that's keeping a southerly flow working up the west coast. That's what's pushing that surface freezing line we just saw further and further northward into the Bering Strait. So as long as that's there, conditions are going to stay a little bit more on the mild side in the west, but we see the opportunity for that colder air to finally drop southward across more parts of central and southern Alaska. As we look at 9,000 feet for tomorrow, high pressure is still in charge of the interior, so wind speeds are going to be a little more erratic but light across most of the region. Broad south and westerly flows working up the west coast with wind speeds from 15 to as high as about 20 to 30 knots. A little bit more of a west and southwesterly flow for the Aleutians, and you can see winds still coming in from the south across the Pribilofs. Northerlies are picking up around 25 knots, and again, we're going to have some stronger winds flowing through the surface regions here across northern and central parts of southeast. 9,000 feet, you can see those drainage winds shaping up here thanks to that strong high pressure gradient sitting right across the Yukon Valley. Northerlies continue across the Copper River Basin. Look for wind speeds around 15 to 35 knots and more of a west-southwesterly onshore flow there for southwestern Alaska, and more of an offshore flow around the Chukchi Sea coast with 30-knot winds there. turbulence potential. There's obviously going to be some high wind threats there across the central and northern sections of southeast tomorrow. So watch for isolated areas of light, isolated moderate. Well, that should be a pretty broad brush, I guess, but isolated occasional severe across the Juneau area and points northward. Otherwise, offshore below 5,000 feet, you will see occasional moderate. And across the west coast and northward toward St. Lawrence Island, we expect some chop around 4,000 feet and below, and also across the central and western Aleutians. Stay tuned. We'll be back with the rest of your aviation forecast in just a few minutes. Stay tuned. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and joining us today is Eric Stevens from GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Thank you for joining us, Eric.
My pleasure, Dave.
Thank you. And you're joining us here to talk a little bit more about satellites and how satellites work, and especially one neat feature that's working over Alaska right now. What is that?
Well, there's a lot of weather satellites and a lot of instruments on these satellites, and there are new generations going up and new instruments. This includes something called the Day-Night Band, which is not a cover band at the local bar, but it's a new satellite that is very useful, especially here in Alaska, especially in the winter.
In the wintertime, yeah, that makes it a little bit hard to use some of the normal tools that we associate with weather satellite imagery.
Right. You know, one of the classic weather satellite instruments is just visible light. What would the human eye see if you were riding on a weather satellite yourself and looked down and it was black and white? You'd see the clouds reflecting the sunlight. And we've got an example from the Pacific Ocean. There's a geostationary satellite, and we can see that the eastern side of the image is in daylight. The western side, it's night over there, so you don't see anything because there's no sunlight over there. And visible imagery, it's very intuitive. You see the clouds just like you see them standing on the ground, but now you're a satellite seeing them from above. But the problem is, what about the night side of the planet? How do you track the storms? How do you know where the rain is, the snow, the weather, if you can't see the clouds? And that's why, just like a television can change from one channel to another, or a radio can change stations, satellites can change the frequency of the electromagnetic spectrum that they're looking at. We can go to infrared instead of visible light. You know, it's heat energy. You can see heat, and we've got another satellite picture from the same time, same satellite, out over the Pacific Ocean. That's the infrared side, and we're seeing temperature there. And even at night, when there's no light, everything still has a temperature.
So we're sensing something with a thermometer instead of perhaps the visible side of that, is what you're saying?
That's right. On this depiction, colder features are lighter shades, warmer features are dark. And so clouds tend to be colder than the ground. Clouds are higher in the atmosphere, it's cooler. And so that very same image on the western or the left-hand side of the globe, now we can see the clouds there, even though it's nighttime, because we're seeing the temperatures. And one nice feature is that tropical storm there, just in the middle of the northern hemisphere there, hurricane or typhoon, depending on...
That's that swirly part that we see in the middle of the image?
There you go. You can even see the eye on it there, especially in the infrared image. So we've got two kinds of imagery there from the same satellite, different instruments, you know, different channels like on a television, visible and infrared. You know, it turns out there's no one magic tool. Each has its strengths, each has its flaws, weaknesses. The visible is nice, it's intuitive, it's easy to understand, but doesn't work at night. Infrared is nice, it works at night, you can see temperatures, but there is a catch. What if your clouds and the nearby bare ground or open water, what if those were about the same temperature?
Oh, that's going to be hard to figure out what's going on.
If you can only see temperature and you have two features that are the same temperature, they will look the same. You won't be able to tell. They're camouflaged. This happens, especially, it can happen around Alaska, especially over the ocean when you have low clouds that are the same temperature as the open water.
It happens quite a bit in Alaska.
We have an example. Now, this is from a different geostationary satellite. It's down over the Atlantic Ocean. Look in the South Atlantic. In infrared, we've highlighted in a yellow circle there. There's some patches of clouds, but it looks like there's a clear area in the middle of that image. That's the infrared look. But let's take a look at the visible channel, and we can see there's a stripe of clouds across the middle of that circle that is only visible in the visible. The trick here is that those are low clouds of about the same temperature as the surrounding ocean. So from an infrared point of view, where you're seeing temperature, the clouds in the water nearby are the same temperature, they look the same. It's only on the visible that you can see what stands out as the actual imagery. Two tools, each have their strengths and weaknesses. Can we combine them? That's where the day-night band comes in.
Oh, okay.
It's a super sensitive visible sensor that can actually see by moonlight. It can even see the aurora.
Wow.
And in Alaska, we have long winter nights. We can use that day-night band. Here's an example from that storm that blew the Kullik drilling platform ashore near Kodiak Island in December back in 2012. This image is right near when that storm happened, and it's in the middle of the night in December.
But this looks like visible imagery.
Looks like daytime imagery. It's amazing. That sensor can take any little bit of moonlight and just make the most of it. We can see so much detail. Even in the northern part of the image there, you can see some aurora up there. The northern lights.
That's that band that goes across the Arctic slope?
You got it. That's the northern lights. We're seeing black and white image here, so you don't get the green or the purple colors there. But that is the aurora. There's another example of the day-night band, and this is from January of 2013. It's about 4 in the morning, and this is a snapshot from Weather Service software. And we can even see in the middle of the image, there's the lights of Fairbanks and North Pole over to Eielson Air Force Base. Anchorage and Matsu lights, city lights, are evident as well. We can see, even though it's 4 in the morning in January, there is no sunlight to be had, that just enough moonlight is available that this sensor can see that. So we're trying to solve that puzzle where visible light is good, but only during the daytime. IR is good at night, but you can't see the difference between clouds and ground sometime. The day-night band is an attempt to do the best of both with one tool. And it's brand new for Alaska here, and we're hoping to use it in the forecast process and help predict storms, weather patterns, to help get good forecast for people.
Okay, another tool in the weather toolkit for meteorologists in Alaska and researchers worldwide. Thank you so much, Eric, for joining us today. And you can learn more about GINA and the day-night band by going to the web address that you see on your screen. For Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider. If you haven't been to that GINA website in a while, you should really check that out. There's always some very interesting and wonderful imagery there to check out just in our own corner of Alaska. Cool stuff, including the aurora this time of the year. Now, looking at the sea ice edge, you can see that's really starting to fill in across the Chukchi Seacoast into Kotzebue Sound, and also expanding quickly around Norton Sound and the YK Delta. So many more communities seeing a return of the ice across the west, and probably a thickening and hardening of the ice across the Arctic coast. Anytime you want to check out the latest ice edge for your community, you can do that by going to weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php. And even if you don't want to look at the maps, you can read the outlooks there that talk about the sea ice forecast as we go through the rest of the winter season and into the spring. Here's a look at the forecast now for Thursday in southeast. Obviously, with high wind warnings and a Taku wind, you're talking about some pretty severe gusts. Gusts on the order of 60 to 70 knots are expected there across the Juneau area and across the inner waterways. 40 to 50 knot winds sustained from the north and east throughout the day on Thursday, with 8 to 14 foot seas. Northwesterlies through the Clarence Strait around 35 knots, and that offshore wind obviously feeding into a trough of low pressure sitting just offshore. Northeasterlies about 30 to 35 knots should be expected, with 10-foot seas in most areas. Now Friday, some big improvements, still looking at some stronger gusts on the order of 50 knots around the Juneau region and the Lynn Canal. Northerlies around 30 to 35 knots, with northwesterlies a little bit further south. An onshore wind coming into the northern entrances, otherwise a northerly flow coming down the coast south of Sitka, with 9-foot seas on a 25-knot wind on Friday. Across south central, light northeasterly winds inside and outside of Prince William Sound, about 10 to 15 knots. Northeasterlies coming down Cook Inlet, southerlies crossing Shelikof Strait at 15 knots with a 3-foot sea, otherwise westerlies just east of Kodiak Island. And around the Barrens, a northwesterly flow coming east of the Barrens at 15 knots with a 4-foot sea. By Friday, you can see a little bit more of a southerly flow returning to the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula. Northeasterlies inside of Prince William Sound, southerlies just on the outside at 15 knots, and you'll keep a light easterly flow heading into Resurrection Bay, with a 6-foot sea there, and otherwise northerly drainage type winds coming down the Cook Inlet at 15 to 20 knots with a 4 to 6-foot sea. Across the Alaska Peninsula, southerlies there for the southern tip of the Alaska Peninsula at 30 knots with a 9 to 14-foot sea on the Pacific side. 11-foot seas coming into Castle Cape and east of Chignik, with an 11-foot sea, and southeasterlies inside of Prince William Sound. Those diminish going into Friday down to 10 knots with a west and southwesterly flow on the Pacific side, and southwesterlies also develop north of Cold Bay with a 7-foot sea on Friday. For the Aleutians, a west and southwesterly flow as the frontal boundary is sweeping over the chain, 30 to 35 knots in all areas. One exception, though, south of Unalaska and Nikolsky at 25 knots with a 17-foot sea. For Friday, back to work in westerlies moving through the central and eastern chain, 20 to 25 knots, 15 to 25 knots on the Pacific side, 11 to 14-foot seas there, and southwesterlies from Kiska to Attu with seas around 9 to 11 feet. Across the west coast, south and easterly winds running up the coastline there around 30 to 35 knots, 9 to 12-foot seas in most areas, 11-foot seas south of St. Lawrence Island. Southerlies coming through the Pribilofs at 40 knots with a 7-foot sea. Gales continue in most areas, especially on the southern half of the Bering. For Friday, southerlies coming up the YK coastline, 15 to 30 knots. Freezing spray close to the ice edge. You should watch for that, of course. And westerlies through the Pribilofs around 10 knots there with a southwesterly flow through St. Matthews Island waters with a 11-foot seas are expected. Now for Thursday, across the Arctic coast, 15 to 20 knots across the Beaufort Seacoast. Southeasterlies blowing offshore from Barrow all the way down through the Chukchi Seacoast. The strongest winds will be in the Kotzebue Sound region at 30 knots with a 6-foot sea. And then for Friday, we're looking at winds to diminish a little bit and become east to west across the Beaufort Sea. Still looking at southeasterlies from Point Lay all the way down to Kotzebue Sound, 20 to 25 knots. Again, this will be for Friday. Recapping tonight's weather, it looks like a clear and cold night for the central and eastern interior. A 1,035 millibar high pressure system sitting across the Beaufort Seacoast, and that extends all the way down into the Yukon, where the pressure level comes up to as high as 1042. Well, with a trough of low pressure across the northern and eastern Gulf Coast, and you can see the tight packing of those isobars there, we're setting up for a Taku wind across the Juneau region, and some very strong gusts should develop overnight. With that, a high wind warnings in effect starting at 3 o'clock tonight and going all the way to about midnight on Thursday. So we're expecting that that's going to continue through most of your Thanksgiving Day, and as a result, winds could be gusting on the order of 60 to 65 miles an hour around the Juneau area. So probably some turbulent flying weather there for sure. Visibility doesn't look too bad, but there does look like there's going to be the potential for some damaging wind gusts. So time to tie things down before you start dinner tomorrow. Low pressure around the Pribilofs at 982 millibars, still working its way eastward, bringing a chance for some rain and snow across the western Gulf Coast as we wrap up the week. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow and happy Thanksgiving.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.